Welcome to the Draft Brewery. Today I got a little special bonus deck list coming straight from the Pauper realm. Basically, I got close to building a Pauper deck and I was like, alright, let's just do it. There's constantly more people online playing Pauper rather than standard Pauper. Consistently, when I get home from work, I'll be hard pressed to find a standard Pauper game, but there's always people playing Pauper. And so when I did my deck tech on Dimir Mill, the one I won Worlds last season for SPDC, it was interesting because some dude in the comments was like, "This deck is awful. It gets crushed by goblins and all these other Pauper decks that are really fast." And I was like, "Well, guy, you're not looking at a Pauper deck. You're looking at a standard Pauper deck." Well, there was a guy in the comments who also said he thought we could translate this Dimir Mill control deck to Pauper, and we started hashing back and forth and brewing up a list, and it was constantly changing, blah 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 blah. And over time, a lot of the cards were similar from the deck, the standard Pauper version, but over time, there's like 0 cards that are in that deck, like Countermand and Pilfered Plans, all these incidental milieu cards. They're just all awful. So I played with it in Pauper for a while, and then started making changes based on what me and my friends had for card availability. This is sort of a budget deck, but I think there's only a few cards that would be good for it. I think Exclude is like $5 common or something that is potentially good, but these are the cards we had, and this is what I've honed over probably the last month while waiting for cons to come out. So the key principle of this deck is to play 0 creatures. If we play 0 creatures, we blank a lot of potential removal spells and counter spells, potentially like Exclude from our opponent. And the point of the deck is to mill them out. So the win condition is Curse of the Bloody Tome. You could play Jace's Erasure. Comes down earlier, harder to counter, but it only mills 1 per turn. This is guaranteed 2 per turn. Now with card draw on the deck, you obviously get to mill more with Jace's Erasure, but it's not consistent. And if you draw Jace's Erasure late in the game, and you've already drawn a bunch of your card draw spells, you sometimes wouldn't mill them out fast enough. So I'm typically not going to play Curse until I have to, or until I know the coast is clear. But in general, it's a pretty solid win con in this deck. And so right now I've come to play 3 of them. Sometimes you can mill them. If you get 3 of them to play early, the game ends very quickly if you stabilize. Sometimes you don't draw one ever, but you just kill other guys and finally draw one, and then barely mill them out. But I just find it to be pretty good. I saw someone was using Dreadwaters as well, which in this deck is actually really good. The problem is that there's a lot of decks that play counter spells and discard spells, and when you're waiting to Dreadwaters them until the very end of the game, mill them for 15 when you have a bunch of lands in play, sometimes they can interact, which kind of sucks. So that's my win cons. That's how I'm winning the game. This is as close to Nephalio's Drownyard as I can get in Pauper. So let's look at the builds. We'll start with a mana base. We're going 4 Dimir Aqueducts. It's a lot. Sometimes you have 2 of these in your opening hand and no other lands, and it's awful. But the point of them is to return Radiant Fountains. You need potentially to gain a lot of life against some of these fast aggro decks. Against the control decks, it won't matter at all. But these decks that are playing Lightning Bolt, Delver, and Goblins, every bit of life counts. So after cons got released, you got to upgrade the Dimir Guildgate to Dismal Backwater, and you could play all of them, right? But it's too many comes into play tap lands, and you'd just rather gain a life than not. So that card is fantastic addition to this deck. It also made me realize how good card like this is, Pristine Talisman. So it lets us get to the top end of our curve, some flashback spells, some buyback spells, but just having the ability to gain 2 life a turn is insane against the burn decks and some of the decks that are trying to close the game out quickly. And if we can just stall just a little bit, then we can, our card advantage and removal kind of takes over and gives us more time. So yeah, so spells for the deck, I guess Condescend counts as a 1-drop, but it is not. It is basically a 1-of counter spell that has the ability to scry, which is good. I like, in these types of control decks with a lot of instants, I like to keep them guessing and not know what we could potentially have. So if we don't have 2 blue open, they might just say, oh, he probably doesn't have a counter, because they hadn't seen one for the whole game or something, and then we can play this. Other counter spells include its namesake. Card's very good. Also 1 deprived. This lets you pick up a Radiant Fountain, which is pretty good. Again, gaining life, but you don't want more than 1. You don't want to be doing this all the time. It just sets you back on tempo too much. Other instants that we have on 2 mana, Think Twice. Again, probably one of my most favorite cards in control decks. I just, ask Wafotapa. This card is just fantastic. It always lets you do something, even when your opponent's playing around things. It's the glue to the deck. It keeps it together. And if you think Think Twice is good, well, AK, Accumulated Knowledge, basically does the same thing, except it can be even more explosive. And the real choice of this deck, now that Cons has come out as well, is to play cards like this over something like Treasure Cruise. And you could play like Ponder or Preordain, and all these other little cantrippy spells to get some card advantage. But with this type of deck, when you have a lot of instant speed removal, I don't think Treasure Cruise is where you want to be. Treasure Cruise is for the proactive decks. So I'm totally fine with these cards. Again, I would want to be playing like Evolving Wild, Terramorphic Expanse, and the Treasure Cruise E-type decks, but I'm committed to gaining life off my lands because some of the aggro decks are so fast. And I still think my mana is pretty good despite having colorless lands and tap lands and stuff, that the free life gain is worth it. Because really, the aggro decks, creature-based aggro decks, are what I run into most commonly, and they can be tough because they can hit hard. So beyond that, let's look at the other instance we have. We have Echoing Decay. I think this card's fantastic. I don't think I messed around with this figure at first. I don't think that's worth running at all, even though it costs less. The fact that your opponent has to either play around this, or the fact that it can hit multiple creatures and get even more card advantage that way is just fantastic. Sometimes they do things too, like they play 2 Razor Golem guys, the 3/4 Vigilance guys, and you have 1 Echoing Decay in hand, and it's like, you can draw another one and 2 for 2 them, whereas Disfigure would be a stone blank. So sometimes you have to use 2 Echoing Decays to kill multiple X4s, which can be pretty solid. Diabolic Edict, fantastic card. Budget version is to play Devour Flesh, since you do not care how much life your opponent gains at all. But keep that in mind, this card is fantastic. Now this card actually does it all. While not being an instant, the flashback gives you great game against a lot of card advantage creature decks. And again, we have ways of dealing with tokens, so that hopefully this always gets a big creature. Coming straight out of Modern Masters. I saw somewhere this card had an orange symbol. Orange symbol means mythic rare, but it's a common in Vintage Masters. So this is interesting to me. This card is in concert with the Edict effect. Gives our deck 12 main deck Edict spells, which are basically almost terminates the way this deck plays out. And that's just fantastic. The hexproof deck is very good, and we're just set up to kind of crush them. So what else do we have for instance? The only other instance we have is Crypt Incursion, which fantastic with Curse of the Bloody Tome and against removal, with our removal killing other creatures. It lets us just gain a lot of life. Again, we need that life against so many decks. The second incursion is kind of an insurance policy in case the first one gets countered, or if a graveyard gets removed, or let's say we have to blow this one early with like 4 creatures in the graveyard and we gain 12, but then we need to do it again, but Curse of the Bloody Tomb is online. That's kind of close. I don't know if the second one is super relevant, but that's what I've been running with so far. We've already talked about Talisman. It gets us to the flashback of the Edict. And then our last 2 expensive cards now. First off, we got Mystical Teachings, which is solid because it can find any of our instants, obviously. Usually it's the best thing to find like an AK or a Crypt Incursion when we already have other AKs in the board, or we need to just gain life and not die. Other times you can teachings for the other teachings. Overall, it's not that good in the deck though, but sometimes they have a lot of tokens, and the Echoing Decay is the only card that's going to save us from dying. So yeah, so that's it could be better with like just Exclude at this spot. Prohibit, anything like that. Miscalculation probably would be fine. But yeah, I'm running this right now, and it's been doing alright. The problem is that some of our best cards, Chainer's Edict and Curse and Evankar's Justice, can't be found by it, which is rough. But this card is pretty much overperformed for me a lot of the times. The opponents won't have just tokens, they'll have a bunch of 2 toughness guys. And so I was running 1 in the main for forever, but I'd often want to draw another one. And this is also a great combo as a secondary win condition. Let's say they keep Oblivion Ringing or Curse of Bloody Tome. We can't mill them out, and we draw more cards than them, so we're going to mill ourselves out. Well, if we can kill all their creatures and then gain 2 life per turn with both these talismans, then we can effectively negate the Justice and Symmetry to this card, keep their board clear like Pestilence, and kill them through damage. We also have a lot of life gain through our lands to hopefully be ahead on life to kill them with this Justice. So, interesting secondary win condition. Again, Talismans help us get the buyback mana for it. So yeah, so that's the main deck. It's a little bit soft to Goblins because they're so fast. It's a little bit soft to heavy control decks. This deck, again, is kind of budgety. I think blue-black decks that run Mole Drifter, Trinket Mage, Grim Harvest potentially are better than this deck. Right? Because they can just keep getting their Grim Harvest back. We can't really exile that card. I guess we could play Syncopate, but it's super narrow, and I think Scrying 2 is just better than exiling a card most times. It's kind of the reason why people play Dissolve over Dissipate in Standard right now. So beyond that, we got a sideboard to check out. So here's the sideboard. Pretty simple. So what cards are good for what? Well, first card here is Dispel. This card is insane against 2 decks. The Burn deck, that is just flinging spells at your face. This saves you a lot of life, and it's pretty insane against decks playing counter spells and other instants. So that's why you want 4 of it. It's very cheap and efficient. Duress, similar line, except this can hit a lot more than just instants. We can hit other players' Curses of the Bloody Tomes or Jace's Erasures. That's actually really key and control mirrors that I've ran into. Can hit things like Rancor before, sometimes they land it early before we can have removal up to kill their guy. Sometimes just a key counter spell. Sometimes just seeing their hand will obviously give us enough information to craft the game so that we know a lot more how to sequence our spells. It's just really solid. Next card, Shrivel. Against a lot of X1s, obviously this is great. That's simple enough. This card is just like a bunch of green mana guys or red goblin guys or white token guys that really strain our removal. And so this card can just get us 2-for-1s or better, which is pretty solid. We have the talismans number 3 and 4 against the burn decks so that we are able to gain life for free every turn. And the 4th Curse of the Bloody Tome when it is basically the control mirror, again, where resolving this card is the most important thing ever. I could play some number of Jace's Erasure, in addition to it, but I don't really run into that type of control mirror super often. So, which is why you can see, the whole main deck and everything here is pretty slanted towards beating creature decks with some alternate ways to win games here. But yeah, so that's the Pauper deck tech, Dimir control. Do not expect this deck to be crushing any daily events, but that's mainly because I don't play them. But there's potential that I start to play a couple of daily events and learn more about the competitive Pauper metagame, because these games are definitely interesting. So yeah, so I hope that clarifies a little bit of YouTube commenters thinking, my standard Pauper deck was a bad Pauper deck. It is, and this is my real Pauper deck. And I know there was a guy commenting on my blog that was really interested in mill decks too, and his was starting to look way different than mine. His deck started to look more, and same with the YouTube guy, he listed his deck. You both were trying to do more of like a aggro mill plan instead of a control mill plan, like playing things like Tomb Scour and Mind Sculpt and just like trying to mill their deck like as fast as possible. And my deck is fundamentally different in that it's milling them secondarily to me not dying. So if you let them, do their game plan is to bring you from 20 to 0, and your game plan is to bring them from 60 to 0, which is a lot tougher. And when you're expending cards like Tomb Scour or Dream Twist, you're getting 5 or 6 cards for 1, but the ratio is not the same. That's like getting 2.5 damage in a burn spell. Except some burn spells can kill creatures, so they have more interactivity. Opponents can also side up to 75 cards if they really fear your game plan, which is why basically the curses or the erasures, whichever ones you're inclined to use, are really the only thing you need, because they're the repetitive source. They'll mill more over the course of the game than anything else. So right now this is what I'm looking to play if I'm trying to play Pauper at all. You know me, I like to brew the control-y of the control decks. I've seen some other good control decks with like the Urzatron lands and some Mole Drifters, Ulamog's Crushers, Treasure Cruises now. If I was going to play Pauper, I would definitely be building around Treasure Cruise, trying to potentially build some sort of blue-red control deck with like a lot of removal, a lot of big finishers, Mole Drifter, Crusher, some Urza lands, stuff like that. So be on the lookout for potentially more stuff like this, but this is just kind of like a little bonus to show people what I've been doing with Pauper. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys.